Our ambition knows no bounds. Push onwards until we reach the heavens.
Our hearts are no longer united. We speak, but we do not hear. Why do we build this?
What if everything you believe about human progress is missing a terrifying truth? The Bible tells us in Genesis 11 verse 1 that the whole earth had one language and one speech. In Hebrew, this suggests more than communication. It implies unity of thought, unity of purpose, a world where humanity was not just speaking together but thinking together. Perfect alignment. And that kind of unity is not just powerful, it's dangerous. Because when human beings act as one, without restraint, nothing stands in their way. This was the world that emerged after the flood, a world born out of judgment. In Genesis 9, God establishes a covenant with Noah, a promise sealed with a rainbow. Mercy is given. But something else survives the flood as well. Human nature, and with it, memory. The memory of destruction, the memory of divine judgment, the memory of how quickly everything can be taken away. So humanity begins again. They multiply, they spread, but not far. Because instead of fully obeying God's command to fill the earth, they begin to cluster, to gather, to hold on to one another. Scripture says they settled in the land of Shinar, an ancient region known in Mesopotamian history as the cradle of early civilization. This was not random. Shinar was a place of emerging power, structure, and human ambition, and rising within this early civilization was a figure the Bible introduces in Genesis 10, Nimrod. Described as a mighty one on the earth, and a mighty hunter before the Lord. But the Hebrew implication of before the Lord can also mean in defiance of the Lord. Nimrod was not just a hunter. He was a ruler, a kingdom builder, one of the first to centralize power after the flood, and Babel was at the heart of his kingdom. This is where the story shifts from survival to control. Because under leadership, unity becomes something else. It becomes organized, directed, weaponized, and then comes the moment that defines everything. In Genesis 11 verse 3, the people say, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." This seems small, but it's not. Ancient Mesopotamia was known for its ziggurats, massive temple towers built to bridge earth and the heavens. These were not just buildings, they were spiritual statements, man-made mountains designed to reach the divine. And instead of using stone, they used brick, something created, shaped, and controlled by human hands. This was humanity stepping into creation, not as stewards, but as imitators of God. Then comes the declaration in Genesis 11, verse 4. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered." The phrase "make a name" comes from the Hebrew word Shem. In biblical context, a name is not just identity, it is legacy, authority, reputation that echoes through generations. They weren't just building a tower, they were trying to establish their own glory, their own permanence, their own meaning apart from God, and hidden beneath it all was fear. Lest we be scattered. They were resisting God's command, trying to anchor themselves in one place, to prevent the very thing God had ordained. Unity had become rebellion, and rebellion was being built into the structure itself, brick by brick, layer by layer. And then God speaks. In Genesis 11 verse 6, he says, "Indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them." Nothing. No limits, no boundaries, no restraint. And this is where the tension becomes unbearable. Because God is not threatened. He is revealing something. That unchecked human unity, combined with fallen nature, leads somewhere dangerous, somewhere destructive. And then comes the intervention. In Genesis 11 verse 7, "Come, let us go down," and they're confused their language. The Hebrew word for Babel is linked to Balal, meaning to confuse, to mix, to disorder. And in a single moment, clarity becomes chaos. Words lose meaning. Understanding fractures. The same mouths that once spoke in unity now create division, and the tower stops. Humanity is scattered across lands, across cultures, across languages, exactly as God had originally commanded. But here's the question that lingers in the silence that follows. Was this judgment, or was it protection? Because as we move forward, we'll uncover the deeper truth about these people. Not just builders, but a generation shaped by fear, ambition, and the desire to control their destiny. A people who had seen God's power and chose independence anyway. And, as we examine their story, something unsettling begins to emerge. Because today, for the first time since Babel, humanity is moving back toward that same kind of unity. Through technology, through global systems, through shared language and digital connection. And it forces a question that cannot be ignored. Are we rebuilding Babel? And if we are, will we understand why it was stopped the first time? Or are we moving toward the same line without even realizing it exists? The world that emerged after the flood was not innocent. It was quiet, too quiet. The waters had receded, but the memory of them had not. Every mountain, every valley, every stretch of land carried a silent reminder of what had been lost. Entire generations erased, cities gone without a trace. Humanity had been reduced to a single family, Noah, his sons, and their descendants. And from that small beginning, everything started again. But something had changed. This was no longer a naive humanity discovering the world for the first time. This was a humanity that had seen judgment, that had witnessed the full weight of divine power, and that kind of knowledge does not leave people unchanged. In the early days after the flood, survival was everything. Food, shelter, protection, these were the priorities. The earth itself would have felt unfamiliar, reshaped by the waters that once covered it. And so, people stayed close. Families grew into tribes, tribes into communities, and communities into something larger. Unity was not just convenient. It was necessary, because isolation meant vulnerability. But beneath that unity, something deeper was forming. Fear. Not loud. Not obvious, but present. A quiet fear that whispered, "What if it happens again?" Even though God had made a covenant in Genesis 9, promising never to flood the earth again, human beings still carried doubt. Trust does not instantly replace trauma. So instead of spreading across the earth as commanded, many chose closeness over obedience, control over trust. They stayed together, moved together, built together. And slowly, unity stopped being about survival and started becoming about security. Security turned into dependence on each other, and dependence began to replace dependence on God. This is how subtle the shift was. No sudden rebellion, no dramatic declaration, just small decisions, repeated over time, until the direction of humanity quietly changed. Scripture describes them journeying from the east and settling in a plain in the land of Shinar. A vast open region, fertile, strategic, and ideal for building. But more importantly, it was central. A place where people could gather and remain connected, where no one had to leave, where no one had to be scattered. And that mattered more than anything. Because scattering meant losing control, losing identity, losing the unity that made them strong. So they stayed. And as they stayed, something began to emerge. Structure, order, hierarchy, the early foundations of civilization. People began organizing themselves. Roles formed, leadership emerged, systems developed, and with structure came power, not the chaotic power of individuals struggling to survive, but the organized power of a united people. In a world shaped by fear, strong leadership would have felt necessary. Someone to guide, someone to unify, someone to turn uncertainty into direction. Because fear, when guided, becomes a powerful force. It doesn't just protect, it drives. And soon survival was no longer enough. Humanity began to think beyond the present, beyond immediate needs. They began to imagine permanence. Legacy, something that would outlast them. Something that could never be wiped away like the world before. And that desire is where everything begins to change. Because once humans stop focusing on survival, they start focusing on significance. Who are we? What will we leave behind? How do we ensure we are never forgotten? These questions don't just lead to growth, they lead to ambition. And ambition, when shared by an entire civilization, becomes unstoppable. The unity that once kept them safe, now gave them confidence. Confidence that they could shape their own future. Confidence that they didn't have to rely on uncertainty. Confidence that together they could prevent disaster, and maybe even rise above it. But this is where the tension begins to build. Because the more they trusted in their unity, the less they relied on God. The more they built systems, the less they listened for guidance. The more they focused on what they could do, the less they questioned what they should do. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, humanity began to shift from obedience to independence, not out of hatred, not out of open rebellion, but out of a quiet, growing belief. We can handle this ourselves. And that belief is more dangerous than defiance, because it doesn't feel wrong. It feels reasonable. It feels logical. It feels safe. But it carries a hidden consequence. It blinds people to their own limits. It convinces them that unity equals wisdom, that progress equals righteousness, that capability equals permission. And by the time humanity reached the plains of Shinar, this mindset had already taken root. They were no longer just survivors of the flood. They were builders of a future they believed they could control. A future where they would never again face the fear of being scattered. A future where they would define their own purpose. And all it needed was a single idea. A single vision powerful enough to unite them completely. That vision was Babel. They did not wake up one day and decide to rebel against God. It didn't start with defiance. It started with an idea, a simple one, an idea that felt reasonable, even necessary. Come, let us build. By the time humanity settled in the plains of Shinar, something had already taken hold deep within them. They were no longer just surviving. They were thinking, planning, imagining. They had unity. They had stability. And now, they wanted permanence, because survival keeps you alive, but permanence makes you feel powerful. In a world still haunted by the memory of the flood, the desire to build something that could not be erased became irresistible. They had seen how quickly everything could disappear, entire generations wiped out in an instant. So this time they would create something that wouldn't. A city, a center, a place where everything and everyone could remain connected. This was more than architecture. It was psychological. A defense against fear. Refusal to ever be scattered again. And then came the second part of the idea, the tower, not just tall, but reaching into the heavens. Now, to understand this, you have to step into their world. In ancient Mesopotamia, towers like these, ziggurats, were believed to connect earth and the divine realm. They were sacred structures, designed as stairways for the gods, places where heaven and earth could meet. But this tower was different. Because this one was not being built to reach God. It was being built to replace dependence on Him. Every brick laid was a statement. Every level built was a declaration. We will rise on our own. We will secure our future. We will define our destiny. And this is where leadership becomes crucial, because ideas like this don't spread on their own. They are shaped, amplified, driven. This is where Nimrod's presence becomes impossible to ignore. Described as a mighty ruler, a builder of kingdoms, Nimrod represents the first glimpse of centralized human power after the flood. A man who understood influence. A man who could unite people under one vision. Under his influence, unity became direction. Direction became ambition. And ambition became a movement. The people no longer just shared a language. They shared a vision. Scripture captures it in a single line. Let us make a name for ourselves. This wasn't just about recognition. It was about identity, authority, legacy. In Hebrew thought, a name meant more than what you were called. It meant what you represented, your influence, your place in history. They wanted to define who they were without God, to establish meaning on their own terms. Because if they could build something great enough, lasting enough, visible enough, then they would never be forgotten. They would not need divine approval. They would become their own source of significance. And beneath all of it was fear, lest we be scattered. They remembered the command. They remembered the possibility, and they rejected it, not openly, but practically. Instead of spreading out, they built up. Instead of trusting God's plan, they engineered their own. And as the tower rose higher, something else rose with it. Confidence. A dangerous kind of confidence. The kind that comes when everything seems to be working. The kind that blinds you to risk. Because from their perspective, nothing was going wrong. The city was growing. The tower was rising. The people were united. Everything made sense. Everything felt right. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because the most dangerous moments in human history are not when things are falling apart, but when everything seems to be coming together. Brick by brick, they reinforced not just a structure, but a mindset. A belief that together, they could overcome any limit. That there was no boundary they couldn't push, no height they couldn't reach, no future they couldn't control. And as this belief spread, it became absolute. No dissent, no hesitation, no one stepping back to ask, should we be doing this? Because when everyone agrees, no one questions. And when no one questions, anything becomes possible. The tower became more than a project. It became a symbol of human potential, but also a symbol of human pride. Not loud, arrogant pride, but quiet, confident independence, the kind that says, we don't need help, we've got this. And the higher they built, the further they drifted. Not physically, but spiritually. Distance from God is not always measured in space. Sometimes it's measured in dependence. And they were becoming completely self-dependent, self-directed, self-defined, and yet from their perspective, they were succeeding. That's what makes Babel so unsettling. There was no immediate failure, no warning signs, no cracks in the system, just progress. Steady, visible, undeniable progress. Until the moment, God looked down, not in surprise, not in fear, but in full awareness of where this was leading. Because what they were building was not just a tower, it was a future where humanity would be united, powerful, and completely disconnected from the one who created them. And that combination is where everything changes. Because unity without truth, power without wisdom, progress without guidance, always leads somewhere. And that somewhere is never where people expect. The tower kept rising. The people kept building. The vision kept expanding, and from the ground, it looked like humanity was winning. But from above, it looked very different. Because what they saw as progress, God saw as danger. And the higher the tower reached, the closer humanity came to a line they didn't even know existed. A line between growth and destruction. A line between independence and separation. A line that, once crossed, changes everything. And they were getting very close. At first glance, the Tower of Babel looks like a construction project. A city, a tower, a people working together. But if you stop there, you miss everything, because the real story is not in what they built. It's in what they were trying to become, on the surface. Their words seem simple. Let us build. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered. But beneath those words lies a deeper intention, a shift in identity, a quiet transformation of the human heart. This was not just about reaching the heavens. It was about replacing the need to reach for God at all. Because think about it. If humanity could unify completely, if they could organize, build, and create without limits, if they could establish identity, security, and purpose on their own, then what role would God have left? This is the tension at the center of Babel. Not height, but independence. Not ambition, but self-sufficiency. They were not trying to meet God. They were trying to remove the need for Him. And that is far more dangerous than rebellion. Because rebellion still acknowledges authority. Independence tries to erase it. This is why the tower matters. In ancient cultures, towers, especially ziggurats, were places where humans sought connection with the divine. But Babel reverses that idea. Instead of reaching up in humility, they build up in control. Instead of seeking God's presence, they attempt to establish their own. It becomes a man-made access point to meaning, a system where humanity defines truth, purpose, and destiny. And this is where something subtle but critical happens. Unity becomes an echo chamber. Everyone thinking the same way. Everyone reinforcing the same belief. No external correction. No higher authority. No voice strong enough to interrupt the direction they were heading. And when that happens, even wrong ideas begin to feel right, because they are shared, validated, repeated. This is the hidden danger of collective human power. It doesn't just multiply strength, it multiplies error. If one person is wrong, they can be corrected. But if everyone agrees, who challenges it, who stops it, who even sees the danger? And that's exactly where Babel was heading. A world where humanity defines its own reality, its own morality, its own limits, or rather, the absence of limits. Because once you remove dependence on God, there is nothing left above you. Nothing to answer to, nothing to restrain you, only your own capability, and capability, without guidance, becomes dangerous. Because just because something can be done does not mean it should be done. But at Babel, that distinction was already fading. Their focus was not on wisdom. It was on possibility. Not on purpose, but on achievement. Not on truth, but on power. And power, when unified, accelerates. It compounds. It expands beyond control. That's why God's observation in Genesis 11 verse 6 is so critical. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That is not admiration. That is a warning. Because nothing impossible sounds like progress until you ask the deeper question. What happens when flawed beings have unlimited ability? What happens when ambition is no longer checked by humility? When progress is no longer guided by truth? When unity is no longer anchored in something higher than itself? The answer is not growth. It's distortion. Because human nature, left unchecked, does not move toward perfection. It moves toward self-exaltation, toward control, toward dominance, and eventually, toward destruction. But here's what makes Babel even more unsettling. They didn't see any of this. From their perspective, they were succeeding. Everything was working. The system made sense. The results were visible. The unity was strong. The vision was clear. There was no reason to stop, no reason to question, no reason to doubt. And that is the most dangerous place a human being can be. Not when things are failing, but when everything appears to be working perfectly. Because success can hide direction. It can mask consequences. It can convince you that you're right, simply because you're moving forward. But movement alone does not equal truth. Progress alone does not equal righteousness, and unity alone does not equal wisdom. Babel was proving that in real time. They were not just building a tower. They were building a system, way of living, a way of thinking. A world where humanity becomes its own source of meaning, its own authority, its own God. And that is the core of what they were really trying to do. Not reach heaven, replace it, not connect with God, become independent of Him, not seek identity, create it without Him. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Because when humans stop looking up, they start looking inward. And when they look inward for ultimate truth, they find something unstable, something inconsistent, something easily corrupted, and when millions of people build a world based on that, the result is not unity, it's eventual collapse. But the danger is that collapse doesn't happen immediately. It builds, slowly, silently, under the surface, until one day it becomes unavoidable. That's where Babel was heading, not toward heaven, but toward a future that looked powerful on the outside and was deeply unstable at its core. A future where humanity had everything except alignment with truth. And that kind of future never ends well. There is a moment in every story when everything changes. For Babel, that moment did not come with warning. No thunder, no fire, no visible sign that something was about to go wrong. From the ground, everything looked perfect. The city was alive with movement. Voices echoed in unity. Instructions flowed effortlessly from one mind to another. Hands worked in rhythm. Brick after brick, level after level, the tower stretched higher into the sky. It was working. That's what made it so dangerous. Because when nothing seems broken, no one thinks to stop. But while humanity was looking up at what they were building, God was looking down at what they were becoming. Genesis 11 verse 5 says, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the sons of men had built." That phrase, came down, is not about distance. It is about attention, deliberate, focused. A moment where God examines not just their work, but their direction. Because what was rising on earth was revealing something deeper in the human heart. And then comes a statement that shifts everything. Genesis 11 verse 6. "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." This is what they begin to do. Begin. This was only the start. The tower was not the end goal. It was the first step. And God saw where it was leading. Not just a structure, but a trajectory, a future where humanity, unified and unrestrained, would push further and further without limit. And that is where the tension becomes overwhelming. Because this is not fear from God. It is foresight. He is not reacting to what they have done. He is responding to what they are becoming. Because unlimited potential in the hands of flawed beings does not lead to freedom. It leads to corruption, escalation, distortion, and eventually, destruction. But from the ground, no one sees this. No one senses danger. The people continue building, laughing, planning, dreaming, completely unaware that they are standing at the edge of something irreversible. This is the most haunting part of Babel. They were closest to being stopped, at the exact moment they felt most successful. And then, the decision is made. Genesis 11 verse 7. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. It happens instantly, without warning, without transition. One moment, perfect clarity, the next, complete confusion. A worker reaches for a brick and hears words he no longer understands. Instructions are given, but they sound foreign, familiar. Voices become unrecognizable, meaning disappears. Communication fractures. Panic begins to spread. At first, it's subtle, a misunderstanding, a pause, a moment of confusion, but it grows, fast. Voices rise, frustration builds. People repeat themselves, louder, slower, desperately trying to reconnect. But it doesn't work, because something fundamental has been broken. Language, the very thing that held them together, has been shattered, and without it, unity collapses, coordination fails, trust weakens, confusion spreads like fire. Groups begin to form, small clusters of people who can still understand each other. But between those groups, division, separation, distance. The same unity that once made them powerful now turns into fragmentation, and the tower stops, not because it falls, but because it can no longer be built. The momentum is gone, the vision is broken, the shared purpose disappears, and for the first time since the flood, humanity is no longer one. They are divided, scattered, exactly as they feared, exactly as God had commanded. But this moment is more than just the birth of different languages. It is the breaking of something deeper, a disruption of human alignment, limit placed on collective power, a boundary drawn between what humanity can do and what it should do. Because without that boundary, there would be no stopping what came next, no slowing it down, no correcting its course. And that is why this moment is so powerful. Because from the outside, it looks like interruption. But in reality, it is intervention, not destruction, redirection. Because God does not tear down the tower. He removes the ability to continue it. He doesn't destroy humanity. He disrupts its path, and in doing so, he introduces something humanity had not experienced since before Babel: difference, diversity, disagreement. Things that feel like weakness but are actually protection, because division slows things down. Forces reflection, creates distance between impulse and action, and that distance matters. Because without it, humanity moves too fast, too far, too blindly. And that's exactly where they were heading. The moment God intervened was not just about stopping a tower. It was about stopping a direction, and just like that, the silence returns. But this time, it's different. Because now, instead of one voice, there are many, and the world will never be the same again. At first glance, it looks like God stopped Babel because of pride. That's the explanation most people settle for. Humanity became arrogant, so God humbled them. Simple, clean, easy to understand, but incomplete. Because if pride alone was the issue, there were many other moments in history where humanity was just as proud and far more corrupt. Yet Babel stands out. Why? Because this wasn't just about what humanity was doing. It was about what humanity was becoming. There is a difference. Pride is an attitude, but Babel was a direction, a trajectory, a shift toward something irreversible. God's words in Genesis 11:6 reveal it clearly. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That statement is not about ego. It's about potential, unlimited potential. And that is where the real danger begins. Because potential is not the same as wisdom. Capability is not the same as righteousness. And power is not the same as alignment with truth. Humanity had reached a point where their ability was expanding faster than their character. And when that happens, the result is not progress, it's imbalance. Think about it. What happens when flawed beings gain unlimited power? What happens when there are no barriers, no resistance, no external correction? What happens when unity removes every obstacle except the one within? Human nature. Because the real problem at Babel was not the tower, it was the human heart behind it. A heart shaped by fear, driven by control, and slowly drifting away from dependence on God. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. They weren't trying to do something obviously evil. They were building, creating, organizing. From the outside, it looked productive, even impressive. But direction matters more than appearance, because you can build something incredible and still be heading somewhere dangerous. That's what Babel represents. Not evil in its obvious form, but misalignment in its most subtle form. A world where everything works, but nothing is anchored in truth. And that's why God intervenes. Not to punish effort, but to protect humanity from itself. Because without intervention, there would be nothing to slow them down, nothing to interrupt their momentum, nothing to force reflection. And without reflection, humanity does not correct its path. It accelerates. That's the danger of unified power. It doesn't pause. It compounds. It builds on itself, faster and faster, until consequences become unavoidable. And by the time those consequences appear, it's too late. So God steps in, early, before the damage becomes irreversible, before humanity crosses a line they cannot come back from. This is not restriction, it is restraint. The kind a parent uses with a child who doesn't yet understand the consequences of their actions. Not to limit growth, but to guide it. Because growth without guidance is not freedom, it's risk. And that risk, at Babel, was global, universal. Every human moving in the same direction, with the same mindset, toward the same goal. There was no alternative perspective. No opposing voice. No friction to challenge their thinking. And without friction, there is no refinement. Without resistance, there is no correction. And without correction, error becomes amplified. That's what Babel was becoming. System where human ideas could grow unchecked, where wrong assumptions could scale globally, where flawed thinking could shape the future of everyone. And once that kind of system is established, it becomes almost impossible to stop, unless something disrupts it from the outside. That disruption is what God introduces, not because humanity lacked intelligence, but because it lacked alignment, not because it lacked vision, but because it lacked truth. And truth cannot be replaced by unity. It cannot be created by consensus. It cannot be sustained by effort alone. Without it, everything eventually collapses. Even the strongest systems. Even the greatest civilizations. Even the most unified people. Babel was on that path, and God saw it before they did. That is the real reason the tower was stopped, not because humans were too strong, but because they were not ready for the strength they were building. Not because they reached too high, but because they were moving in the wrong direction. And if that direction had continued, the outcome would not have been progress. It would have been destruction, just slower, more structured, more advanced, but inevitable. So God interrupts. He introduces limitation. He creates distance between people so they can no longer move as one unchecked force, and in doing so, he preserves something essential. Time. Time for humanity to develop, to grow, to learn, to struggle, to question, to rediscover dependence on something greater than itself. Because without that process, humanity does not evolve, it escalates. And escalation, without wisdom, always ends the same way. That is why Babel had to stop. Not because of what it was, but because of what it would become. The confusion of language did more than stop a tower. It reshaped the entire structure of human civilization. In a single moment, the unified system that had defined early humanity was broken apart. Communication, once seamless, became fragmented. Coordination collapsed. Large-scale cooperation became impossible. And without the ability to function as one, the people had no choice but to separate. Genesis 11 verse 8 states, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city." This scattering was not random. It was the beginning of distribution. Groups formed based on shared language, small clusters of people who could still understand one another. These groups became the foundation of early tribes, and eventually, nations. What had once been one people became many. Geographically, this led to migration in multiple directions. Some moved east, others west, spreading across regions that would later become known as Mesopotamia, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Culturally, this marked the beginning of divergence. Different languages meant different ways of thinking. Different ways of thinking led to different traditions, systems, and identities. Over time, these differences solidified into distinct civilizations. What is often overlooked is how this changed the pace of human development. Before Babel, progress was centralized and accelerated. One idea could spread instantly across all people. After Babel, progress became decentralized. Ideas developed independently. Innovation slowed, but also diversified. Instead of one unified direction, humanity now moved in many directions at once. This created both limitation and opportunity. Limitation, because large-scale unity was no longer possible. Opportunity, because diversity introduced variation, adaptation, and resilience. From a historical perspective, this moment explains more than just language differences. It explains why civilizations developed differently, across regions, why cultures vary so deeply, why human history is not a single story, but many parallel ones. And yet, beneath all those differences, there remains a shared origin, a point in time when humanity was one, unified, aligned, and then divided. Not destroyed, not erased, but dispersed. And from that dispersion, the world as we know it began to take shape. For thousands of years, Babel seemed like a closed chapter, a moment in the past, a lesson already learned. But look closely at the world today, and something feels familiar, because for the first time since Babel, humanity is moving back toward the same kind of unity, not through bricks and towers, but through systems, global systems, digital systems, invisible structures connecting billions of people in real time. Today, language is no longer the barrier it once was. Translation happens instantly. Communication crosses continents in seconds. Ideas spread across the world faster than ever before. In many ways, the confusion of Babel is being reversed. We are learning to speak to each other again. And with that comes something powerful: collective influence. A single idea can now reach millions, instantly. A single narrative can shape entire populations. A single system can coordinate actions across the globe. This is not theoretical. It's happening. Every day. Technology has given humanity something it has never had before: near total connectivity. And with it, a new form of unity. But here's the question that matters. Is this the same kind of unity that once built Babel? Because the pattern looks familiar. A shared direction. A growing dependence on human systems. A belief that, through innovation, we can solve everything, control everything, define everything. From artificial intelligence to global economies to centralized platforms that shape what people see, think, and believe, humanity is once again building something massive. Not a tower of brick, but a structure of influence. And just like Babel, it feels like progress. It feels efficient. It feels powerful. But the same danger still exists. Because the issue was never the tower. It was the direction. And today we have to ask, are we building with wisdom or just capability? Are we questioning the direction or blindly accelerating? Because modern systems are doing something very similar to Babel. They are aligning thought, standardizing behavior, creating environments where millions of people can move in the same direction at the same time. And when that happens, the same risk returns. If the direction is wrong, the scale of the consequences becomes massive. Because unity multiplies impact, not just for good, but for error. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The more connected we become, the less we question. The faster things move, the less we reflect. The more powerful our systems get, the more we trust them, without always asking whether we should. This is exactly how Babel began. Not with rebellion, but with confidence. Confidence in human ability. Confidence in shared direction. Confidence that we've got this. And now, we stand in a world more advanced than anything Babel could have imagined. But facing the same fundamental question, just because we can build it, should we? Because history doesn't repeat itself the same way. It evolves. And if Babel was a warning, then the question is no longer what happened back then. The question is, are we listening now? When you strip away the tower, the city, the confusion of languages, what remains is a question, not about history, but about the human heart. Because Babel was never just about what people built. It was about what they believed. And more importantly, what they stopped believing. At its core, Babel is a story about dependence, or the loss of it. In the beginning, humanity was designed to live in relationship with God, to trust Him, to follow His direction, to recognize that meaning, purpose, and identity come from something beyond themselves. But at Babel, that connection begins to fade, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, subtly, replaced by something else. Self-reliance, the belief that we can define our own path, create our own identity, build our own security. And at first, that doesn't seem wrong. It feels natural, even empowering. But here's the deeper truth. Dependence on God is not weakness, it's alignment. It's what keeps power from becoming destructive. It's what keeps progress anchored in truth. Because without alignment, even good intentions drift. And that's what happened at Babel. They didn't set out to destroy anything. They set out to secure themselves, to protect their future, to create something lasting. But in doing so, they moved away from the very source that gave their existence meaning. And that shift is the real warning, because it still happens, not through towers, but through everyday decisions. Every time we choose control over trust, every time we rely on our own understanding without seeking something higher, every time we build our lives around what we can achieve instead of what is true, we echo Babel. Not in scale, but in direction, and direction is what matters most. Because you can move forward quickly and still be going the wrong way. That's why the story doesn't end with destruction. It ends with scattering. Because God doesn't erase humanity. He redirects it. He introduces limitation. Not to harm, but to create space. Space to reflect, to question, to realign. Because without that space, we keep building, keep moving, keep accelerating, without ever asking if we're aligned with truth. Babel reminds us that unity alone is not enough. Progress alone is not enough. Even success is not enough. If the foundation is wrong, everything built on it eventually collapses. But there is also something hopeful in this story. Because even after Babel, humanity continues. Nations rise, cultures form, history unfolds. Which means this is not just a warning, it's an invitation to pause, to look at the direction we're moving, to ask deeper questions. Not just, what am I building, but why am I building it? Not just, can I do this, but should I? Because in the end, The real lesson of Babel is not about a tower that once stood. It's about a choice that still exists. The choice between control and trust. Between independence and alignment. Between building something impressive and building something true. The Tower of Babel never reached the heavens. It never touched the sky the way they imagined. It never became what they hoped it would be. But it didn't fail for the reasons they expected. It stopped because it had to. Because what they were building was not just a tower, it was a path, a direction, a future where humanity would move forward, faster and further without ever looking up again. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Because Babel was not the end of something. It was a warning about something that never truly went away. Humanity's desire to rise without limits, to create without guidance, to define truth without alignment. And today, we stand in a world more advanced than anything they could have imagined. We build faster. We connect deeper. We reach further. But the question remains the same. Are we moving in the right direction? Or are we just moving faster? Because the danger was never the height of the tower. It was the distance from God. And distance doesn't always feel like rebellion. Sometimes it feels like progress. That's the deception. That's the tension. That's the line. The same line they approached without realizing it. The same line we may be approaching now. But here's what Babel also reveals. God did not destroy humanity. He intervened. He redirected. Which means, even when we move in the wrong direction, there is still a chance to realign, to pause, to reflect, to choose differently. Because in the end, this is not just their story. It's ours. The question is not whether Babel happened. The question is whether we understand it. Because if we don't, we risk repeating it. Not with bricks, not with towers, but with systems, with ideas, with a world that looks strong on the outside, but is drifting on the inside. And one day, just like before, everything can change in a moment. So before we keep building, before we keep accelerating, before we keep moving forward without questioning, ask yourself this. What am I really building? And where is it leading? Because some paths look powerful, right up until the moment they break. And if this made you see things differently, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel and like this video, because the next story might change the way you see everything.